For those who may be critical of the current political and social settlement and seek to understand the changing winds of history as our current era or age may come to a close, it is the alternative approach we must pursue, whether it be reaction or conformity, revolution or restoration. We are often stuck between these different options. Yet, instead of being reactive or conformative, perhaps it is necessary to be something else entirely, that is, creative. Thus, it may serve us much good to construct a meaningful alternative, rather than simply conforming or reacting to every change or development, thus being subsumed by a false dialectic. Many online may have succumbed to what I would call the slop outrage machine. That is the redirecting of rightful political anger down certain safe avenues that allow for dissent to be controlled and allow for opposition to certain things to be controlled. Whether it be the scapegoating of particular groups and only focusing on some of the issues but not all of them, or targeting a specific group of people but not holistically understanding a given issue. Or it provides simplistic narratives that only point to part of the problem but create a blind spot for other parts of the problem. In other words, they want you to be angry, but what they want is not for that anger to be channeled in a meaningful manner, but rather for it to be channeled down these supposed avenues of dissent that really act as methods of control, that allow for the shifting of narratives in a way which does not challenge the fundamental power of the elites, but rather channels anger towards a scapegoat or towards a certain set of issues, but not towards other set of issues. More broadly, the solutions that are oftentimes suggested may have certain blind spots or may have certain issues to them. Two methods which are often presented in regards to breaking out of the established settlement are as follows. One of them is revolution and the other is restoration. The first one, which is revolution, is particularly a kind of terminology or methodology that is utilized by many on the left. Ted Kaczynski's insight into leftism is particularly interesting here, that it is a reaction of resentment to modernity. And indeed, one can understand and sympathize with that sentiment. Indeed, one can sympathize with that statement. Marx, for example, discusses the alienation of the worker in industrial capitalism. But in truth, I would say that it is true of modern industrial societies as a whole, regardless of economic or political system. Indeed, the modern industrial machine strips man of all that is organic, replacing it with a system of artificiality where he is a mere cog in the machine of industrial modernity. The anarchist writer Paul Kudenek points out that it is the life-denying nature of modernity itself which divorces man from the organic, from the natural, from his relationships to everything around him, from other human beings to nature and to his work and the products of it. Thus, mass production becomes prioritized over quality and creative artistic value. This is true of modern societies as a whole, regardless of economic or political system. Self-evidently, there are a number of flaws with the current political settlement, or with modernity more broadly. However, most things, quote-unquote, paradoxically or in a contradictory manner, tend to have a dual nature. Thus, for the sake of fair, nuanced, and holistic analysis, it is only fair to point out that modernity provides several immense benefits as well. Proportionally, it has simultaneously done immense good and evil. It is thus not necessarily possible nor desirable to return to a pre-modern settlement, or the advantages granted by modern industrial societies, for they are simply too great. A collapse in modern industrial production will lead to the death of millions, even billions, across the world. This, in fact, does lead on to a separate issue that affects much of revolutionary thought, particularly that on the left, and indeed on a lot of the left which has been influenced by modernist and scientific thought. For those stemming from the modern and Enlightenment project, they inevitably end up intensifying and accelerating many of the worst aspects, worst processes, and worst aspects of the logic of modernity. Inevitably, when you buy into the modernist framework, the disagreement will be within this line of thought, not outside of it, or not breaking away from it. Thus, from the left of the authoritarian communists, and this is referencing the anarchist Paul Kudenek, quoting from Voline, a common critique of them is that they are authoritarian state capitalists. This was a common critique leveled at the USSR by those on their left, mainly that essentially the USSR had become a state where the means of production is held by a few bureaucrats, who historically committed atrocities and acts of oppression against the workers it supposedly claims to represent. The other method is that of restoration, one which can also be understood and sympathized with. Thus, it is a return to something more primordial and fundamental, usually based within the context of tradition, community, the folk, etc. It is a return to what has organically stemmed and developed from a people over thousands of years. They may thus provide systemic solutions to the issues of alienation, to the breakdown of communities and families, etc., etc. Yet this also runs into a number of problems. Just as how revolution may in fact just stem from certain aspects of our dominant framework or worldview, so too may the current one simply stem from the old anyways. If we talk in terms of tradition, from a historical perspective, these are very much organic developments, constantly evolving, thus acting as a springboard for these changes to occur. An argument made by some, for example, one which I have seen made by the likes of the folkish writer Imperium Press, is that the axial age systems or philosophies and their various faith traditions were the springboard through which modernity could arise. However, I would argue and go so far as to say that the pre-axial age traditions and systems of philosophy, for example, created the conditions for and acted as a springboard for the axial age systems of thought to arise and develop. Framing is important here. In taking a bird-eyes view of history, we understand that these developments stem from one to another. It is precisely that the old creates, quote-unquote, the conditions for the new to arise. Over the course of history, these differing developments arise precisely due to the differing conditions across time and place. Hence, we can't simply restore the older once the current has burned to ashes, for the conditions and demands of a new era will not allow for a tradition at a certain stage of development in a historical context to simply be restored. Indeed, the collective conscience of a group shifts and evolves over time, responding from one development to another, akin to responding from one stimulus to another. And this is an issue that both restoration and revolution will face, in that they try and achieve things for their own sake. Thus, revolutionaries may advocate for concepts of progress and of revolution for their own sake, without due thought for what it is exactly that should be achieved by these means. And the restorationists and the traditionalists may simply seek to replicate tradition and hierarchy for their own sake, without due regard for what it is that they should be seeking to attain. In other words, they simply replicate these means in and of themselves for their own sake, and not looking at the broader spirit behind these things. What also complicates matters is the constantly shifting ideological divides and conflicts, and the constantly shifting ideological landscape that we are currently on. Steve McIntosh, in his interview with P.F. Young in a video they made, suggested that modernity arose partially, or at least one of the reasons why modernity arose, was due to the conflict between what was perceived to be the religious worldview and the scientific worldview, which led in the West to the political settlement of liberalism. Of course, there is a lot of nuance with everything, so take all of what I'm going to say with a pinch of salt. Modernity, or within the modern era, we have seen the clash of secular humanist ideologies. These clashes and these wars defined the 20th century primarily. Arguably, these are not over yet despite the end of history hypothesis, which has self-evidently been disproven. The rise of religious fundamentalism poses a challenge to the modern, more secular worldview, and this is something that Samuel Huntington has discussed in his work Clash of Civilizations. But furthermore, the Enlightenment and liberal projects themselves are coming under attack, as pointed out by Davies, and the rise of ultranationalism and more identitarian politics serves to prove this point. But there is another angle by which modernity is being attacked, that being post-modernity, and in particular the progressive deconstructionist kind. Many sociologists may consider that we are currently in late modernity, where many aspects or processes of modernity are intensified. In any case, there are the conditions for the kind of dialectic that is being created. Mainly, there are different kinds of dialectics at play, but one possible one is that between the postmodernists, and especially the progressivist types, and the liberal center, or by the modernist sort of consensus or the dominant worldview that we have. However, if the old settlement breaks down, which arguably it may already have been, or at least it's in the process of breaking down, it may reignite the conflict between the more religious worldview and the more modern scientific worldview, and thus the condition for a kind of trialectic may be created, where both the more religious worldview, the modern worldview, and that which leans into, let's say, liberalism or certain leftist ideologies, and that between postmodernism or this kind of deconstructionist progressivism may be created. Thus, the conditions for this kind of trialectic between these three forces may come into play. Postmodernism, particularly the contemporary progressive deconstructionist kind, may be a kind of X factor here to be considered. It is quite unique in its deconstructionist tendency, which does have an incredible amount of insight, more than what many may give it credit for. In reality, this deconstructionist analysis can be co-opted by traditionalists or those who seek to construct a tradition anew, for inevitably the deconstruction of the old necessitates the construction of something anew. The paradox at the heart of postmodernism regarding objective truth translates to the social and political. Thus, their analysis, whilst being excellent in being descriptive by its very nature, cannot be prescriptive. Indeed, it is incapable, even actively wary of doing so. In other words, it cannot pass judgment upon the descriptions which it makes of these various discourses, quote unquote. They can identify that these discourses exist, they can analyze them in a deconstructionist manner and identify these aspects of it, but it cannot prescribe moral judgments whether it's good or bad or what should take its place. Thus, a very common critique of the whole concept of discourses as understood by postmodernists is that it simply replaces one discourse with another. In reality, there is no meaning to a society or a group of peoples existing without these discourses. They do not merely exist in a kind of vacuum. It is important to get the framing right. Tradition is an organic development stemming from the peoples who participate in it, who help shape and develop it. There is a kind of symbiotic relationship here when they help guide the evolution of one another. It is thus not a biological determinist nor blank slate argument, for people are born and bred in the context of these traditions, yet they actively shape and develop upon them as well. Thus, we cannot merely restore an old way because the conditions of old are no longer present, nor can we merely revolt and establish a quote-unquote new way that simply intensifies or accelerates the processes of the current, but rather what we need after the deconstruction of the old, where the ashes of its burnt remains preside, we must rather reconstruct. We must reconstruct for the conditions of our time and challenge and deal with the demands of our era by reconstructing this tradition anew. This reconstruction can thus act as a solution or alternative. It isn't merely conforming, and in fact can achieve the best express aims of both revolution and restoration without some of the issues that naturally arise with both. Thus, it is a revolution with organic purpose, not for its own sake or to intensify aspects of the current. It is a restoration of that which is truly primordial and organic to man, not merely restoring the practices or hierarchies of old for their own sake, but rather it is a construction of one anew, befitting of the individual and the collective, not merely deconstructing without any viable alternative. Most importantly, this said reconstruction is creative, not merely reactive or conformative. It allows for an appropriate application of the principles of old in current conditions, whilst simultaneously allowing for organic developments stemming from the old to occur. But most importantly, this reconstruction will allow us to meet the needs and demands of a new era. Once faith or adherence to many of the meta-narratives or discourses has broken down, once certainty itself is deconstructed, only then can it be reconstructed anew. Have we yet hit critical mass for such reconstruction to occur? Has this process fully played out yet? Or are the conditions necessary for this reconstruction to occur from the ashes of the old yet to come into place? These are important questions or objections, one which I do not have answers to completely, and yet, as framing is important, these will be important to answer. This reconstruction is not merely defined in terms of the past, present and future, nor merely in terms of modernity in support or opposition of it, but rather possessed by a genuinely creative spirit, seeking to incorporate all these facets and aspects to meet the pressing existential, philosophical, socio-political, spiritual needs of the day. It can thus incorporate aspects of religion or pre-modern, modern and even postmodern worldviews within this reconstructed framework. Thus, it is from the ashes of the deconstructed that shall arise the fire of a reconstructed worldview anew.